Okay. I guess we'll give it a few more minutes. It looks like there's still some people coming in. You can look at this very formal stuff. So I'll just explain a little bit about some of this while we're waiting. I don't know, how many of you are aware of my organization, the New Jersey Center for Healing? Ah, great. So for those of you who know or don't know, we are entering our 33rd year, and we are now considered to be one of the first integrated mental health outpatient settings in the country. And we do things that, back when I started this, were considered very unconventional. We do whatever we can to bust stigma. So coffee houses and concerts. We use play therapy, drama therapy, sandtray therapy. We do a lot of things off-site, a lot of social opportunities. Yoga, mindfulness, a lot of the mind-body. We have an in-house functional medicine doc, chiropractor, and integrative massage therapist. Reiki, we're going to start Zumba pretty soon. So these are not things that back in the 1980s you would see in a mental health center. And what happened as a result of that was that in the early 1990s, we had several boards of examiners coming into the center to see if we were violating scopes of practice. So when I look back on the early beginnings of this organization, it is really a story in itself. And the fact that we are now considered to be cutting edge and in demand for internships, and it's for me a great joy. As a result of that, in 2010, I was invited to Arizona to an integrative mental health conference that Andrew Weil was putting on, and 16 people from around the globe who are considered to be integrative mental health, most of them psychiatrists. We together formed the International Network of Integrative Mental Health. We have colleagues now across the globe, Russia, Iceland, just about anywhere you can think of. And most of it is virtual, although very recently the organization asked if I would take it on to run it regionally through our center. So we're going to be offering a lot of integrative mental health continuing ed. I'm going to be offering a certification program in integrative mental health. And so that's the newest development. Healing space design is just something that happened to me really through intuition and it ties in to what I'm talking about today, in that when you come for counseling, there's a certain kind of an environment that's conducive to that, or not. So if you go into a very conventional office, and you've got the same, lined up chairs, and the magazine racks on the wall, and it's sterile, and nobody's talking to one another because, they don't want to violate confidentiality. A long time ago, we decided to change that completely. So you walk in the door, and it's more like a home. The way we have it laid out has seating, that's by choice. If you want to be in the middle of the goldfish bowl, you can do that. If you want to be in private, you can go to another area. If you want to sit with the children and see them draw, many of our adults sit on the chairs and color too. It's just that it presents an environment that honors the person, that tells them that we don't see them as patients, and it provides the natural interaction that just happens there. So you'll walk down the hall and you'll see people engaged in a hub, all talking. And it's just been something for me that happened organically, and now I'm trying to do that more in my career because I just think it's unfair, the kind of settings the people are going to, and that they're finding it, that they're very much feeling more like a patient than a person. And the last one on this list is Ethnographer. So how many in the room know much about ethnography? Ah, great. So ethnography, which is part of what I'm talking about today, is really from the field of anthropology. That was a minor of mine in undergraduate school. And from ethnography, which we're going to talk about more in a minute, autoethnography arose. So ethnography is the study of others. Autoethnography is the study of oneself. So to do a dissertation like I did, and my dissertation is going to be defended very shortly after the new year, so even at this age I've decided it was a goal and I wanted to complete it. And I took on an autoethnography, which studied every detail of my own life, with the mission being that I would come to understand, why did I do this? What was it? And those questions, those deep questions, are the questions that our clients want answers to. But they don't sometimes know how to ask. They don't even know they're searching. Instead, it comes like packaged in problem. So now I'm doing some consulting on helping others write autoethnographies. Why I struggle with PowerPoints just had to be thrown in here. This was not something comfortable for me, and all the things that I have done in my career, I have managed to escape doing PowerPoints. I've used whiteboards, I've played it off the cuff, I've used notes, and I've done what I'm one of the only two presenters here today didn't do, which was to give in advance our handouts. So the reason I don't give you handouts was one of the reasons for these things. I believe that I am just a storyteller by nature. It goes all the way back in my life. I come from, in my father's lineage, the Magyars, and so they were storytellers. What is important, which we're going to talk about today, is the story. The story is best understood in a context. It requires interaction, so I really want you to be involved today. Process is important. Distraction fragments a story. So if I were up here today and I were using the kinds of slides where you've got all these charts and graphs and you can't read what's in the little boxes, and you would be distracted by that, and since the brain sometimes just can't do too many things at one time, I want you to focus on me. So, and then we need to allow a story to unfold. We need to arrive at an organic, completion. And for all these reasons, I struggle with PowerPoints. But I had help today. And she's standing right back there. Well, part of this dropped off. But what this question is, and it's a question that I want you to ponder today, and that is, what brings you here today? So we could answer that now, and for several of you, it would probably be, you're here to learn, for CEUs. It's convenient, you're at the school. Looks good if you come. But I want you to rethink this question later on in this presentation. Oh, there we have it. So I want to tell you a little bit more about my story, not because I really am doing it so you know all about me, but it's an example of why context is important when we're working with our clients. We can't really understand a story unless we understand the bigger picture of someone's life. So I'm going to be very candid with you right now, and Matt Terrell knows this and asked me to speak anyway. I have some biases against the word countertransference. We're going to talk about it later. It's not that there isn't a place for it. There is. We need to learn it. We need to learn what it means. What I believe, though, and I learned this more from ethnography than anything else, there's a way to use it and even rename it that puts us in a very different place. But any ethnographer is going to be looking at sometimes entire cultures. They're going to be going into villages. Now, this is back in the day when they worked with the natives. But in our profession, we sometimes spend a great deal of time with our clients too. You know, I do not have a personal practice that is brief therapy. I have been working with some of my clients for 30 years. Now, this does not mean they're in therapy for 30 years, but we have such generational loyalty in our center that we have the children, grandchildren, and even some great-grandchildren of our first clients. Once they come to us, they very seldom go to anyone else. So for me, really, it has been like a whole study of cultures, of families. But to understand even how I got here, and why I'm here speaking with you today, and why I feel like I have earned the respect to be speaking to you today, is so much more about my life than it is about what degree I have. So, just briefly, I grew up on a farm. Growing up on a farm, which was a culture of its own, I learned lessons that school never taught me. It's just natural on a farm that when there's something that goes wrong, the whole community pitches in to help. You know on a farm that you can't do everything alone. You learn how to ask for help. You know that there is an organic process to everything. You watch planting a seed and seeing it grow. It's just a simpler life. And life itself is more important than what you do. Those values have come forward with me. I was in one of the first desegregation schools in New Jersey. I was there the day that they bussed in the African American students from Seaside and South Toms River. There were policemen lining the halls. They expected there to be a problem. There was not a problem. It was an amazing day to see that what was expected and even they were prepared for didn't happen at all. It was peaceful. After that, you know, growing up in the 60s was its own culture. And I loved it. You know, and I still own the title of being a hippie. Woo! Many of my classmates went to Vietnam. You know, I wore the black armband and marched down the streets of Philadelphia. The Black Panthers took over our cafeteria at Temple University. I was in the cafeteria when they shut it down. I got to talk firsthand with a lot of people and learned a lot of things, and none of it was bad. After that was the MOVE movement. I had a friend who lived right around the corner when the MOVE people were bombed. I knew some of those people from walking around that area. That, for me, was an enormous turning point in my life. It felt, for me, fracturing, unjustified, and I knew I had to do something about it. But after that, I moved back to the Pine Barrens of New Jersey and opened what was then called the Open Center. The Open Center is what was the beginning of what the New Jersey Center for the Healing Arts is today. And then I found out that I would not be able to have children, which is something that I very much wanted. My mother died within a week of my hysterectomy. But at the same time, it was the women's movement, the ACOA movement. LGBT then was such a stigma. We held healing circles for people with AIDS, which was right when it was an epidemic. And we had picketers picket outside of our building. Holistic healing was something then that was considered more New Age, but for us, it was a perfect blend. And that's when we brought massage and yoga into the center and made those services available to people with AIDS. And what was beautiful about that, and very, very sad, is that it was very helpful to them, but at the same time, it was tragic for every single healing circle night for them to talk about who was the next person who gave up their life. Should they let people talk about them at their funerals and out them? You know, nonetheless, we kept healing touch services in our center to the point where the boards of examiners came and tried to understand if we were violating the scopes of practice. But in the end, there was no sanction. Instead, we were given bona fide agency community status. And we changed paradigms for touch services in mental health care. So for me, that was kind of like a witch hunt. And for me, it also meant that the paradigm needed to shift. Then I got cancer. Another turning point. You know, to realize that no matter what comes in your life, no matter what suffering you have, you can always find a way to use it, to give meaning to it. And we're going to talk more about that. After that turning point is when I joined the International Network for Integrative Mental Health, and now I'm teaching what I learned. This is the concept, the context of my life that influences why I'm doing what I'm doing now. I brought that up because we need to understand that when we sit with a patient or a client, and some clients like to be called patients, but when we sit with them and we're looking at the problem, the presenting problem, and we're starting there, we can't really understand who they are or why they have that problem because we don't know the context of their lives. And we need to know what it is. I'm looking back because I'm dating myself. Like I'm speaking where I've got myself in front of me. So what we're really talking about when we look at our whole lives being necessary to understand where we are at any given point in time. In anthropology and in ethnography, is called the lived experience. It's foundational to the field of ethnography. And what it means is not every single detail of our lives, but it does mean that whatever we have experienced in our lives at a very deep level influenced how we see, and it influenced our knowledge about ourselves and about others. So, as I said before, ethnography is influenced by anthropology. It's a study of a way of life. It's a tool for understanding the whole person, really, but also systems, cultural systems. And it is an experience, an immersion in the unfamiliar. That's really important to what we're talking about today. Because what scares a lot of interns more than anything else is that they end up in situations that are totally unfamiliar. They haven't been there, they don't know how to relate to it, they're terrified they're going to make a mistake, and as a result of that, and they often feel like they have to lead it. They have to ask the questions. They've got to keep the pace. And the reality is, we've got to let the stories unfold. The role of an ethnographer is to understand another person's way of life from the point of view of the other. Now, that word other in ethnography is more important than we normally think of what that word means. Because other takes on an entire cultural identity. When we say other, it really means the difference, the not just being different from, but that it's really something very, very deep that is different about them from us. And that there's another term that goes with it, which is othering. Othering happens when a client or any person feels that we are treating them as other. So what we want to do is to make those people in our offices as comfortable as possible and believing that they are very much present and whole to us. And if we don't understand them, ask to know more. I get so many young interns in my practice that feel, I don't know how to relate to them. I don't know what that means. It's never happened to me. Clients like to tell stories. They like to feel that you're interested in them. Let them educate you. The original ethnographers went into tribes. They even had to get interpreters because they didn't know the language. They didn't know anything about these people. They had to ask them before they could help them. And that's what an ethnographer does. So you probably are already beginning to see that there are some parallels between ethnography and the practice of counseling and therapy. Storytellers in context, we've already talked about. There are some things, though, that are very important as we move forward, because context is that which influences the meaning of our story. So if I have a story, let's say it's about having cancer, my story about that is going to be very different than even someone else's. Because it's about how it affected me. It affected my life, how it affected my practice. You know, for someone else, it's about, maybe it's about what it feels like for them to fear they're losing their children. You know, for others, it's about what the medical community, how they feel dismissed. So we can't just assume. Even if we do relate to the problem, we can't assume that we understand that we relate to it the way they did. We have to know more. So the meaning is considered very, very subjective. We have to find out what it means to them. And so problems are explored and they are, looked at within a bigger context. Now, one question that might come up right away, because we know that the field is really moving toward cognitive behavioral therapy and brief therapies. First of all, not every client wants or even needs CBT or DBT. Some clients are willing to even pay out of pocket to see therapy more as a lifelong education than it is about coming with a problem. Some clients choose, for the sake of their own mental health, to stay in therapy for a while. And others, as we've talked about, will come back frequently or whatever. They need you. Some of my clients call that their tune-up. But when you just look at the presenting problem, and you start there, how can you get to? So I'm going to tell you a little story to illustrate this. So I have had a client now for a long time, and I'll call him Tom. That's clearly not his name. When he came to me, what the presenting problem was is he's a hoarder. He's a hoarder to the point where he could not live in his own home. He had to sleep on his mother's couch because his house was uninhabitable. He had a problem with his furnace, and people couldn't get in to repair it because they couldn't create a path. And so the presenting problem was, can you help me to cure my hoarding problem so I can live in my house? The problem with that problem is it wasn't the problem. There was a much deeper reason that he was hoarding. He had been to at least 6 therapists before me, and the only thing he realized is that none of them could help him with his problem. So I asked him to expand his story, and I asked him some questions, and the way that we ask questions is very, very important. You need to think about it. And we'll talk again a little later about the kind of questions you need to ask, like an ethnographer would ask. So the question was there any other reason in your life when you needed to really hold on to things? That one question went back to the fact that when he was a very young man, and he was at that time a very active alcoholic, and he was coming home from a bar, and he walked in front of an 18-wheeler, and the driver of the 18-wheeler was also drunk, and he was hit, and near death. He broke multiple bones in his body. He was induced into a coma and put in a body cast for 5 months. In that state, he could hear every single thing going on around him, but he could not speak. That metaphor of being trapped, of being voiceless, and then coming out of the hospital to realize that he had lost his apartment, his car was repossessed, he lost everything. That's why he was hoarding. So what if we never got to that story? What if we decided, oh, this is coping mechanisms, and we just need to do something to help him get rid of his junk? So the metaphors are very, very important for us to look at in terms of what the real issue is that we need to deal with. So the role of an ethnographer is to understand the other's point of view. The therapist is a participant, is engaging in the dynamic relationship that he or she creates with the client, and detached observer in assessing the client. So, important words. So an ethnographer, in ethnography, we use the term participant-observer, which means we are both the participant and we are the observer. So now we look at the parallels between what we do as a clinician. We know we're supposed to be observers, right? But the problem comes with, how are we participants? How are we participants without crossing over those lines of being too close? We need to be both. So this is a slide that we're going to look primarily at the top, which is ethnography as a metaphor for clinical practice. Over here, when we say, must be fluent in the languages of the people. Now that goes back again to the time when it was about the Aboriginals and about the natives, and we needed to literally learn their language. But there's another way that we need to look at this. There's another way that we need to be fluid in the language of the people. The language may not be words at all. The one that comes to mind for me is invisible illness. Invisible illness has no language. It doesn't have a cast, it doesn't have a wheelchair. Nobody can empathize with us because they can relate that there's something wrong with us. It's invisible. We can't know how that person feels unless they give us their own explanation of how it feels. It's like a language. If today someone who is recently diagnosed with cancer walks into my office, all I need to say is, I'm a survivor too. I don't have to tell them my story. I don't have to make it be about me. I just need to know I understand the language. There are different languages in a lot of different ways. It's not only cultural. It's like, I happen to know several people who have been athletes most of their lives. Their need to move, their need to exercise is their own language. I can't understand it. I've donated to more gyms than I can possibly tell you. But for them, it is so important to keep that identity. And when they age and they begin to lose it, it is extremely painful. It is the change in their identity. So ethnographers would normally stay within cultures for long periods of time. Now again, we don't necessarily look at that because we're really kind of being sold on brief therapy. But for some people, we know them and we know their families and we know everything from the moment that perhaps in story they were born to the literal day they died. We spend time with people. And our trust is what makes the difference. So here are some of those stories that constitute culture: ethnicity, family, personality, intellect, health and illness, lifestyle. And we could go on and on and on. Because really, every single person relates differently to their culture. And it becomes a culture. You have a culture of friends. There's, when you really look at it, there's a lot of things that have to do with how you yourself are a unique human being. Stories need to have beginning, middles, and ends. So this one is really important because so often in therapy, there we'll call it from the presenting problem to the plot, which is the process, to completion. But without really completing, without really resolving or moving forward, it creates chaos. It creates fragmentation in the brain. And that's why it's really important that once we open up a story, we stay with them until there's some degree of resolution. So this one is really, really important to me because I did a lot of work, even in my dissertation, about suffering. Suffering that a lot of people just don't understand. It's chronic. They don't feel that they have anyone understanding them. That very definition of suffering, in my opinion, is when someone's sense of who they are feels like it's been taken away from them. They feel that they are in so much pain that it's like they don't exist. And we need to be careful not to shy away from discussing those points of suffering in the clinical rooms. It's painful. But unless we help our clients, give them permission, which in a way sounds kind of sad, right? Permission to have a voice, permission to have a narrative, permission to tell us what their suffering is made of. Literally. So the kind of questions that we're going to ask is, could you give it an image? What kind of an identity does it have? When you're alone with your suffering, what does it feel like? And it's amazing the stories you'll get. like sometimes stories that you think could be published. You know, it's like suffering becomes a person. And they're living with it. And they need to tell these stories. This is one of the most pivotal parts of this discussion today. What happens with a lot of people is they get trapped in the lived experience. So now, when we talked about Tom, he was literally trapped, right? He was in a body cast. He couldn't speak. He was held hostage. The problem is that he never freed himself. He never freed himself from feeling the feelings of that. So what happened in his life? He rarely confronted anything. He became voiceless. In any situation where he felt that he couldn't make substantial, successful movement, he would completely shut down and withdraw because he was still trapped. In order to free him, in order to move forward on that, we have to go back there. We have to have him have what he didn't have then, the voice to speak about the experience. It was very painful, but he did it. He did it, and he doesn't really go back there anymore. Still dealing with some wording issues. That one dies hard, but he's doing it more and more and more. Today he looks at it not as something from the past, though. He owns it, he's accountable for it, and he looks at it in a very different way. So now, lying to tell the truth. This is one of my favorites. So the quote is, sometimes you have to tell a lie, to tell the truth. It comes up a lot in supervision when early on in the process, my interns will come in and say, or not just interns, sometimes it's clinicians that have been working in the field for a long time. And they'll come in and they'll say, well, I think they're lying. The story doesn't make sense. My first response is, well, we really have to reframe that one. How do we know they're lying? What if they don't have the whole story? What if they're making up a fairy tale because they can't deal with reality, the truth? We need to stop judging things like that. Who made us the expert to determine whether someone else's story is true or not? And even if they are making up part of it, if you listen to it as a metaphor, you're probably going to hear that what it is they're talking about is giving you hints. They may be creating this whole fantasy of a life they never had because they never had it and they want it. Or they may be telling you a composite of what they do know, but they just don't know the rest. Because when you're trapped in a story that never got finished and it's too painful for you to go and face it, you don't know the truth. But they come to us hoping we're going to listen, as Erickson used to say, with the third ear. We're going to listen in between the words. We're going to watch their body language. Do any of you in here know what brain spotting is? Okay, great. So brain spotting is an outgrowth of EMDR. There were some issues with the EMDR, although incredibly valuable to many, many people. But what happened is that when people who had complex trauma entered the space and they had the finger moving that was, working with the eye patterns, their traumas were imploding because they had more than one. And so brain spotting is about isolating a single trauma and working through it until it's freed. We've done 2 brain spotting 1 trainings at our center, and now we're doing a brain spotting 2 the end of this month. It's a valuable modality. But what you find out when you train for that and when you do it is that there's surprises in there, in the brain. There's surprises, these brain spots that we don't even know consciously exist. But all of a sudden, when we're confronted with a trauma that matches, you watch somebody's eyes go to a certain direction. And they're identifying a brain spot. Very recently, a friend of mine, who was also a therapist, ran into a former person that she had had a brief personal relationship with where it didn't go well. And the person was simply not well enough to yet be trained to be a clinician. And so the person terminated and was very unkind about the reality of that process. And though there was an attempt to resolve and to try to help heal, it just wasn't working. And so it was also very painful for the clinician, who was an excellent clinician and is very honoring and would have done her best. Though we can't put others at risk, we can't not identify when someone is yet not ready. So years go by, and the clinician is harmlessly shopping in a pet store for pet food, and all of a sudden, that person is around the corner and comes down the aisle and is extremely angry and punitive. The clinician is shocked, goes into somewhat of a fugue state. Even quite a significant time later, is very, very different than her usual way of being in thinking about this thing that happened. There's trauma. There's trauma held in there. That was what the experience felt like, even to a skilled therapist. And then when you try to call attention to it, there's defensiveness. Because the real defensiveness is happening because they're defending the horror of revisiting it. So again, we're back to what is reality? What's real? What's real to us isn't necessarily real to them. You know, traumas get trapped in there, and they have a life of their own, and we've got to find them. We have to be detectives. So we've talked about, the stories through metaphors and symbols. I love working with metaphor in my practice. You'll hear it. You'll hear it in your clients. You'll hear them comparing things or using phrases that they're really talking about something else in code, but the metaphors match. And symbol is really important. So we do things like Santre therapy, guided imagery and music, hypnotherapy. There's easier ways than talk therapy to get into the unconscious. And in some cases, you can do a lot more freedom through unconscious modalities. I understand that Monmouth doesn't much talk about Jung these days. I was Jungian trained, and metaphors and symbols are really part of the tools of our trade. So what do? We want to evoke memories, not only by asking, so what, or how. We want to ask them to tell us. Tell me a story about when this happened. Tell me what it felt like for you to experience it. We want to capture vivid images. A lot of times if someone's telling you about something that happened to them, they'll be able to give you an image. They can tell you what it looks like. But you'll notice that these words are less verbal and more sensory. What we're doing is we're trying to get that lived experience into our room so we can deal with it. So now, this one is not anything that's new to us, but it is of incredible importance. And that is that the relationship is the source of transformation. We are essential. I think we forget that sometimes, especially when you're working with a client that it just feels like there's no movement. It feels like it's the same session over and over again. But you know what? If it's the same session over and over again, there's something really important in what that is. And it might be a metaphor. So we want to avoid being experts. You know, it used to be that people would want to know, like, what's your training? What credentials do you have? What university did you go to? Was it an Ivy League school? They might ask you that in the first session. After a while, they don't really care. But what they do care about is, are you presenting yourself as an expert who is other than them? Or are you a partner? There's a term in ethnography, and it's called bracketing. Bracketing means that the ethnographer is able to be with someone they're interviewing, because their interviewees are research participants. They're able to be with them. They're able to keep a safe distance, but they're also able to be in touch. They're trained to be in touch with what feelings are going on within them at the same time that they're with their client or their interviewee. That's a talent, and it's a talent we can cultivate. One of the things I often tell my trainees is, imagine that there's this little room inside your brain. And as you're working with your client and you start feeling those feelings where you're over-identifying and something's coming up for you, imagine sending it into this little room in the back of your brain and save it until you're no longer with them, and then explore it. Explore it with your supervisor if you have one, and I recommend that you'll do. Explore it internally. Keep field notes, which is another ethnographic term. It's the notes you keep when you're in the field, all the stuff that's coming up for you. Chart your own growth. Have that be your very, very personal paperwork. You can choose to share it with your supervisors or not, but it's a wonderful, wonderful tool. So we need to co-author counter narratives. So where does that come in? The clients who really put themselves down, I hate myself, I screwed up again, I'm no good, I'm worthless. Sometimes they're describing shame. And they are holding on to an identity that's no longer functional for them. It has to be updated, but it's the one they know. So we've got to help them reframe it. So what happens a lot in clinical rooms? People act like that, and then a therapist does one of the cognitive behavioral techniques, and let's change your behavior. That's not necessarily getting down to the root of the problem. We have to be gentle, and we need to partner and collaborate, and we can write a new version of their stories. The rupture of self-knowledge. This happens a lot to clients, but it also happens to therapists. There comes a point, a lot of times in our careers, when we're confronted with a situation that is so fracturing to anything that we know. It may be a gruesome death. It may be something that happened to a child, like sexual abuse of a 3-year-old. It might seem like there's no way we can hold it. It's like rupturing our own knowledge of what we are expected to do in these situations. What often happens is we're there in that place ethnographers need to go. We're in the land of the unfamiliar. We doubt ourselves. They're turning points. They're turning points. What we need to all understand is that suffering itself is a turning point. If we don't get stuck in it, if we look at it, know what it is, and we choose to find out, what does this mean for a purpose that I can use? I laugh. Sometimes students will say to me, how do you relate to all these people with all these things? And I look at them and I say, because I've experienced most of them. It's that one little piece, although I say it in humor. I ran into somebody earlier today when I was at the lunch line who knew me from many years ago. And her mother has just died. And she said to me, I've got to find a way to use this suffering. And she will, because that's her attitude. We on the one hand don't want to present ourselves as experts, but on the other hand, we do need to see ourselves as important. We serve a very valuable role. And if we are up to it, we can do amazing things. So for my friend Young, we work through the shadow with our clients and with ourselves. They need to feel that we are with them. They need also this sense of artificiality, where we're supposed to be the tabula rasa, where we don't share anything. I remember once a client of mine that I had been working with for several sessions knew that I had been out for surgery. And the day that I came back to work and she had her appointment, she was getting out of her car at the same time I was, and she looked at me and she kind of ran the other way to get ahead of me to go into the office. And later on, at the beginning of the session, she just sat there without saying anything. And so I asked her, is there something bothering you? Because that was not common for her. She said, yeah, I don't know if I'm allowed to ask you how you feel. Isn't that sad? To be that sense, to feel that sense that I can't even ask this expert how she feels. Of course she can. We've got to form a connection. It doesn't just happen. So you learn how to discern. How do you be a full person with them? There's certainly simple things you can tell without disclosing any of these boundary-violating issues. A lot of my clients' sessions in the very beginning, we do superficial stuff. It can be about the weather. There's a sign on my desk that said, ask me about my cats. They'll talk about my cats. But there's always a time limit on it, and then we resume the work that's really about them. What we're doing is we need to transform suffering into purpose and meaning. And that means when you go through your own field notes and you come in touch with the suffering that you've had, and I will share this with you, when you do an auto-ethnography and you really consciously go back in your life to look at all of the things that you can remember that were in any way traumatic for you, you will often notice that the next thing that happens is a turning point. And that if you realize that by being very in touch with your traumas or your places of suffering, you'll be able to use them. And as soon as you do, you feel an opening. You feel that you have a gift. And your gift came from your suffering. And now you can relate to more people. And it comes out different. When you have that knowledge, it doesn't come out to the client like, oh, I just made this all about me. It comes out from a place of relation. And it's an opportunity for personal growth. So we want to adopt what I call an ethnographic attitude. To look at yourself as a very important person with a very important role. It's an honor. It's an honor to be in this position where we are being handed an opportunity to touch and perhaps transform someone's life. Know that and feel that. Because yeah, there are these times we're taken advantage of. Mental health is at the bottom of the heap when it comes to compensation. Don't let that get in your way. You'll know it and you'll feel it when you sit with your clients. We had a client that came from a cult. And it was a very, one of these painful things to hear about. Children being abused, family culture is just completely corrupt. And there was so much abuse within family that he didn't know, because of the trauma he was holding and the places that he just couldn't get to. He believed that he had been one of the perpetrators, and one of his sisters told him he was. And when he first came to us, he didn't know if he wanted to kill himself, or he referred to himself as a monster. And this went on throughout years of therapy, because there was a missing piece. He literally didn't know. And all of a sudden, last week, he got a letter from his sister telling him that she had gotten in touch with her own trauma, and he didn't do it. And as I stand here before you, hearing that, we were crying with joy. We held him through it, and we celebrated with him. And they're the rewards. They're the rewards that through it all, if we stay with the story, we keep it contiguous, we grow alongside them, then we get to feel that opening with them. I love this quote. Our willingness to risk ourselves, our stories, our identities, our commitments in relation to others constitutes our very chance of becoming human. If we, as ethnographers, honor our role, if we realize, instead of looking at it as beware of countertransference, we look at it more as I'm a human in this room with another human. I'm relating to this human, and that's why I'm feeling what I'm feeling. I'm proud of what I feel. And I know that I have to put this safely away for me to process later the part about me, and be here for them. But if I show tears, that's completely fine. Because sometimes that alone is what teaches them that we care. So that very tool, no ethnographer needs to bracket in a way that they're feeling like they've done something wrong for relating to a client. I remember when I was in supervision years ago, and I went to my supervisor and I said, oh my gosh, I've got this incredible male client and he's telling me about his fantasies about me, and I don't know what to do with that. And her response was, just stop it. If any supervisor ever says that to you, tell them to go packing. Instead, what they should do is hold you, practice. How do you feel it and keep it distant and safe at the same time? Realize it's yours. Realize why you're feeling it. Yes, what countertransference teaches us about don't act inappropriately is true. But the way we look at it, if we're looking at it through an ethnographer's attitude and vision, if we remember the honor that it is for us to be with them, and the fact that because we're sharing humanness, the gift is that we're relating to them. The rest is what we do with it. And that is a skill, and that we need to learn. So my suggestion to all of you as a result of this is to keep an ethnographer's journal. That in addition to your supervision, in addition to what you learn, your academic knowledge, keep this journal that is your kind of ongoing diary of the knowledge that you are gaining about you. What's important for you? I'm going to ask you now, what story brought you here today? Is it more than CEUs? When you look at why you're here in the context of what brought you here to the big here. Why are you a counselor? That's part of why you're here. It honors the rest of your life. So you keep this journal for yourself. You can bring it to supervision if there's something in there that you want to share. But it's the auto-ethnography, just the self-writing, where it's you and you. And you learn from that. And you keep your field notes. So what questions or comments do you have? Yes.
I do have a comment. I thought this was very well done. I know that there's a lot of people who are just still in their placements, and I wish I would have seen something like this when I first was starting off. Just because that issue of countertransference and don't let it hit a button and what do you do when it does happen? I think that whole conceptualizing, because I know there's a lot of times even when I'm counseling that I don't even realize I put it in the box and then the box comes out later and I'm like, oh, there it is. So I liked your idea of even kind of keeping a journal of it, because sometimes, you lose track, even when you get to a point where you're so focused on them and their story, that you lose parts of this is what came up for me. So I did like a lot of the different things you had to contribute.
Thank you. And seek out what you need. Supervisors also work very differently. And so you can learn a lot from different styles of supervision. But if you feel like there's something as you're processing what's coming up for you, and when you're looking at yourself as a whole person, how do we help put together somebody who's fragmented from trauma if we aren't whole ourselves? You know, so the things that are hidden from our own view about us are going to get in the way of our perception of helping someone else get whole.
I'm going to add one more thing, okay?
Yeah.
The big reason why I do like what you had to say is because when I had started off, I remember meeting people who probably, if they just told me about themselves, it would have helped me. Like you had mentioned, all I had to say was I was a survivor of cancer, and they know. You know, and I remember there were so many times where I would feel so singled out as a student. I know I'd cry in a group and they told me, I remember my professor wrote that she was too emotionally unstable to be a counselor. Seriously, but I was going through a lot at the time, and I remember suffering so much, but persevering and finding those people that could relate to me and could make connections and looked at it as a strength rather than it being a weakness. And I can tell you from my own experience as a counselor, my background helped me tremendously. So don't be afraid of it is my point, is because I know for me, my background, my history, my experiences were all like, oh goodness. You know, I know why I'm here because I really have to figure some stuff out. But how do I share this with everybody else? So thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Yes?
And it resonated with me because, like you have to allow your full self to come into the room. And I like this because what you were saying is telling us that we have to find out, our why. Why are you here?
Yes.
And then I take this a step further as a counselor, as a professor, supervisor, or whatever, I have to allow myself to bring my full self into the room.
Correct.
Because if I don't, and if I'm guarded, my client will see that and they won't bring their full self into the room, and we're doing to their disservice.
Absolutely. And you know what? Remember the starting slide where I asked, what story brings you here? That is the first thing I ask a new client when they enter my room for an intake. I don't ask them what the presenting problem is. I ask, what story brings you here today? It changes the entire nature of what they would say. And you know what? The other thing, clients can be trained. Many of them will come in and say, I'm a trained client. I know what you're going to ask me next. I'm going to say, I don't think so. I'm a jack in the box. So, you know, when you put it in those words, what story brings you here, people also often won't start at the beginning of the demographics they just answered on the intake. They don't want to go through that again in person. They already want to know who you are. What are you going to do to help me? But very often, the story they thought they were bringing isn't what they tell you when you ask them that question. Sometimes they go right to the very place that needs to be discovered. And then they turn around and they say, why did I say that? Because they were invited to be broader. In ethnography, we call it get a wide-angle lens. Yes?
First of all, Carla LeBlanc says hi.
Hi, Carla.
I'm like baby student, everything with her. But also, I think this really helps for me to redefine the idea of story. Because I find it so often with our clients and youth is like, okay, you're stuck in the story.
Yes.
So this, I feel, just kind of gave it, I don't know, gave me a whole different perspective on how to be in the story with them and not see them as stuck in their story. And
Yes.
really look at it in a different way.
So just in the way you're saying this, you'll hear that you're already starting to think in that way with your partners. Your partners in that relationship with the potential for transformation, not only for your client, but for you. Anybody else? Yes?
I like how you reframed countertransference because everybody knows eventually you're going to experience it with your clients, and there's almost a fear behind it. And it's like when you're in that moment where you're experiencing it, you're in your head like, oh no, I'm experiencing this. And then you miss what they're saying, it could be so important. And so being able to say like, this is normal, keep going, and like be with them, be present. And
Excellent. And you know, I'll teach you a little of my secrets. A long time ago, and it was because of my self-work. So when I realized, very young in my career, that I was feeling something that was no longer about listening to them. It was something I was relating to in me. I really got in touch with that. I used to keep like this kind of journal way back then. And what I started doing is to start exploring, was there something that could be my warning? And I realized that it was literally a sensation that was like mind body, that this is just what I realized about me, but I'd start feeling like I was literally moving too close to the client. And I have actually used a lot of the positioning of the way I sit in my chair, that my clients now actually know it. It's like, some of them don't respect what time it is and they don't want to stop. And so I didn't even realize I started doing it, but I now sit on the edge of my chair when we're about 5 minutes from the end of a session. And so they start sitting on the edge of their chair now too. And it's like the time ends and we stand up. But these are the kind of, make your profession fun. Use it and figure out, what do I do? Who am I uniquely in this role I'm in? Anybody else? Yes?
Just can listen to you forever.
Aww.
You should have a podcast. This was so inspirational.
Thank you. But you know what?
Can you also, I was talking during lunch to your Kira. Oh, hi.
She's here.
And she was talking about some programs that you have with schools.
Yes.
Can you talk about those?
Yeah. I mean, if you stop at our table, you can even pick up flyers.
I did.
Yeah. So one of the things that we're doing now is I have, first of all, a phenomenal team of interns, and they are so creative, and when you use the word inspiration, they inspire me. They're in what they're learning about practicing out of the box with honor. They are creating, it's like we're trying to find all the gaps that aren't being served, and they're describing them and then defining them, and we're creating groups for them. And we have an entire program now for anxiety, teens and anxiety. And it's becoming a program because we started out with one group and that group filled and we had to do another one right away. And our assumption going in, or our question, we try not to have assumptions at the center, but our question going in was, are teens going to want to come to groups? And it's amazing how they came. Some of them even in pajamas. They felt so comfortable. We have also a therapy dog and a bearded dragon, pet therapy, bearded dragon. She doesn't know she's pet therapy, but So we started doing these groups that are very, very different. Again, they're very experiential. They don't feel like the conventional therapy groups. There's a lot, you could talk to Victoria back there. She's one of the people that create some of these things. But we are partnering with a lot of the schools because, they see it. Right now we're doing a lot of work with gender continuum. And again, there's so many prongs of that, and there's only so much they can do in the schools. We get calls lately from schools asking us if we'll just come in and talk to their team. But sometimes the schools create the programs for us. They'll call and they'll let us know. We need this. Our students need this.
I think that one of the things we do is
Kira is the assistant director at the center.
I think one of the things we do is we help actualize, we really partner together. I mean, what Carol shared was so powerful and so motivational because we are all human beings on the journey together. We don't assume that anyone is fractionized. We just try to learn from them. And that encourages learning, self-learning. So when we learn from them, connected to themselves because they produce some of their ideas. And so that's very powerful. And these teams, really, I think the teams are very involved. I think we have some incredibly evolved people on this planet, and they just need to be sort of supported as they move on their path.
Well, you know what happens, thanks, Kara. You know what happens too is that, like when I said clients are trained clients, a lot of times teens will come in and they're trained already, and they think they know what they're going to expect when they walk into a therapist's office. And they don't understand what they just got, which is that, they feel respected and they feel that we're listening. So what we've talked about today really works with every age. We've worked with 2.5-year-olds. We have to learn their language. We work with the client that I'll never ever forget, who called me when I opened the doors in the first week of the original organization, the Open Center, and she said, and I have permission to use her name. She wants me to use her name, now deceased. But she called me up, she said, "Hello, my name is Angela, and I just saw an article about you in the Two River Times, and I do believe you are my last chance." At 87, no one, they just diagnosed her as having agoraphobia because she wouldn't leave the house. Nobody ever took the time to figure out what was wrong with her. She had a limp. The doctors looked at it and said, "There's nothing medically wrong with you. It's all in your head." I did hypnotherapy with this woman, and she had been raped by the person that did handiwork at her home, and they dragged her down the stairs by her leg. So even physical was trapped in her story. She left my office that day with less of a limp, and over the course of a few months it was gone. Because she wasn't expecting it to be there. Now there was something physically wrong with her at that point, because for any of you who have gone through an injury or rehabilitation and you're walking abnormally for a long time, and then all of a sudden you realize you don't have to, you might still walk that way because you're out of alignment. So we threw some chiropractic in there too. But when Angela was 90, I was at her birthday. I said, "Angela, what are your goals now?" She said, "Well, at 87, I just wanted to be able to feel like a human being. Now I'm 90, and I want to be able to go on a bus to Atlantic City and gamble." She did that. When she was 95, I said, "Angela, what's your goal now?" She said, "Well, now that I finally have a life, I want to live a little longer. So I want to live until I'm over 100. Angela died at age 101. Yes?
I can see this working with Black clients who have experienced racial trauma. Yeah, and a lot of my research is involved with working with Black men who have experienced racial trauma, and I've shown them about identity development. And initially I was tying in narrative therapy. I think ethnography would be a better fit in finding out what their story is. And
Yes.
allow them to resolve their identity issues with regards to their racial identity development.
Great idea. Because it does, by the way, it really does work well with men. It feels less kind of touchy-feely when you explain what you're doing and how it's going to work. So any applications, there's so many applications for use with this. And I love that your brain's already working to find one. So I want to express gratitude to Victoria. Victoria,
You got a few of those slides too.
I did. I'm a quick learn. You know, I used an ethnographic tool, so I think Victoria did about half of them, and then I did the rest. And I used a tool of ethnography which was keep it simple. Don't dig any deeper than you need to dig, but when you know you have gold where you're digging, keep digging. And that's a good metaphor for working with our clients. I thank you all very much.